Well, thank you all so much for coming to the Bidwell House Museum's second talk in our winter lecture series, Hidden in Plain Sight, Native Peoples and the Struggle to Recover Their History in New England. I'm Heather Kowalski, for those of you that don't know me, the Executive Director of the Bidwell House Museum. And before we begin, I just want to note a couple of things. First, please keep your audio off so that we don't get any background noise, but you're welcome to leave your camera on. The controls for both of those should be at the lower left of your screen. If you have any questions for our speaker during the presentation, please type them into the chat feature at any point during the talk, and we'll take some time at the end to answer as many as we can. Now tonight's speaker, Rose Miron, is the director of the D'Arcy McNickle Center for the American Indian and Indigenous Studies at the Newberry Library in Chicago. She holds a BA in history with a minor in Spanish and a PhD in American Studies from the University of Minnesota. Her research explores Indigenous interventions in public history within the Northeast and the Great Lakes regions, as well as American sovereignty and activism in the 20th century. She's currently working on a manuscript project tentatively titled Indigenous Archival Activism, Reclaiming Native History in the Mohican Tribal Archive and Beyond. The project is based in close collaboration with the Stockbridge-Munsee Mohican Nation since 2011 and explores how Native peoples used archives to change the way Indigenous history is accessed and produced. And now I'm very happy to introduce Rose Miron.
Thank you so much, Heather. And thank you all so much for joining today. I'm really honored to be here joining you all from so far away in Chicago, but it's nice. That's the beauty of Zoom in spite of all the horror of quarantine. So I just want to take a moment to thank Heather and the Bidwell House for having me and inviting me to give this presentation. I'd also just like to thank the Stockbridge-Munsee Mohican Historical Committee and the staff of the Stockbridge-Munsee Community Department of Cultural Affairs who have worked with for over a decade on this work and really, could not be doing this research without. So thank you to all of those people. I am joining you from my home in Chicago, Illinois, which resides on the homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, the Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Odawa nations, of the Illinois Confederacy, the Peoria and Kaskaskia nations, as well as the Miamia, Wea, Thakiwaki, and Meskwaki nations. And the Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Kickapoo, and Mascoutin nations also call the larger region of northeastern Illinois home. So we're definitely a place of convergence here in Chicago. And of course, I'm going to be speaking to you today about Stockbridge-Munsee homelands, primarily those in Western Massachusetts, but also those that are part of present-day New York State. So as the title of this event suggests, I'm going to be discussing today returns that Mohican tribal members have made to their homelands, particularly a set of coordinated heritage tours that happened especially in the last quarter of the 20th century. And I'm going to be discussing the way that those trips have cultivated memorial geographies and collective memories of Mohican history and nationhood. So I'm going to be starting today with just a brief overview of Mohican history prior to the 1960s, just to sort of situate that connection to the Northeast that has continued to this day. And then I'm going to pick up in the late 1960s and the following decades in the last quarter of the 20th century, where we really see the height of these historical trips and heritage tours that are led by the Stockbridge-Munsee Nation. And these trips really paved the way for more recent interventions in the landscape of the Northeast and the representation of Mohican histories in this region. So I'm going to end by sort of bringing us up to the present with some of the more recent interventions that the tribe has initiated. So to begin, as I'm sure most of you in this program already know, the Stockbridge-Munsee Mohican Nation's connections to the Mahicannituck, or what is known today as the Hudson River Valley, began long before the start of European colonization. And prior to the 17th century, Mohican homelands extended across the area that you see in yellow on the map. So over both sides of the Mahicannituck and into what are now known as the states of New York, Vermont, Massachusetts, and Connecticut. And Mohican is actually a shortening of Mahicannituck, which means peoples of the waters that are never still. So the Mohican identity is very much tied directly to the landscape of the river. And the Muncie are a separate but related people who are also connected to the larger Lenape or Delaware Nation, and whose homelands lie in the southern Mahicannituck River Valley, and also encompass the very sort of eastern edges of present-day Pennsylvania and the very northern parts of New Jersey. So in 1735, the Mohicans agreed to the establishment of a Christian mission in their existing village, Winnetocook, which today is known as Stockbridge. And the native people who gathered here, which included both Mohican and Munsee people, were known by settlers as the Stockbridge Indians. So that's where the first part of the name Stockbridge-Munsee Mohican Nation comes from. And the Stockbridge-Munsee Mohicans were first forced to leave their homelands in 1783. And then, as you can see from this map, several more removals followed that one and led the tribe through what are now the states of Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Michigan, and as well as the province of Ontario. And the tribe reached present-day Wisconsin in about 1844. At that point, they were on the east side of Lake Winnebago, and more Munsee people joined them there. And then the tribe after that was removed several more times within Wisconsin before arriving on their present-day reservation in 1936, which is really quite late as far as Indian removals go. And I can certainly talk about why that is if people are interested in the Q&A. So given this sort of complicated history, I want to just give one note on terminology before I move forward. As I've said, the Mohican and the Munsee were at once two distinct nations, but certainly have always been related through kinship. And today, these groups make up one nation, the Stockbridge-Munsee Mohican Nation. So you're going to hear me today sort of shorten that full name to Stockbridge-Munsee or to Mohican, but just know that I'm always referring to the combined tribes and their shared history that really begins prior to colonization, but is solidified at Stockbridge and through the removal that they are both forced to take as colonization continued. Now, today, all of this history means that Mohicans are more than 1,000 miles from their ancestral homelands, but it does not mean that they ever relinquished their ongoing connections to this place. And if there's one thing from this talk that I hope you remember, I hope it's that the Stockbridge-Munsee people have never stopped considering this region their ancestral homelands. They've never stopped caring about this area or considering it as an essential part of their identity as Stockbridge-Munsee Mohican people. They've never forgotten this place. And you'll hear tribal members say that, and it's also quite well documented that folks continue to return in spite of these removals. So for instance, Catherine Marie Sedgwick, who is an author that some of you are probably familiar with, actually mentions summer pilgrimages that Mohican people made throughout the mid-19th century. And there are several other trips that are documented by local newspapers in the late 19th century, as well as in the 1930s and the 1950s, just to name a few examples. So those connections and these returns to Mohican homelands have been ongoing really since the 1780s. But today I'm going to focus on the last quarter of the 20th century, when a group known as the Stockbridge-Munsee Historical Committee started leading coordinated heritage tours back to the Northeast as part of this group's larger efforts to recover and to reclaim Stockbridge-Munsee Mohican history, and to reestablish a sense of belonging to these lands among Mohican people, as well as to reteach tribal history to tribal members through place. And what I found by looking at these trips and looking at these aims is that they facilitated what scholar Christine DeLucia has called memorial geographies, which I'm defining in this instance as a new sense of space that reorients and grounds Mohican people in the landscape of their ancestors, and in the process creates collective memories that facilitate and strengthen a shared sense of Stockbridge-Munsee identity and nationhood. So these group trips started in about 1968, and since then there have been at least 20 coordinated trips, and undoubtedly, certainly, many more returns made by individuals and small groups that haven't been quite as well documented as the trips that I'm going to talk about today. And the records from those trips show that they've ranged anywhere from 5 to 40 people, and they've had travelers as young as 2 and as old as 84. But again, certainly these margins could be much wider because some of the trips have better records than others. And the first trips in the 1960s really first began with that first aim that I mentioned, which was to recover and reclaim Stockbridge-Munsee history. And it's no surprise that the trips coincided with the creation of the Stockbridge-Munsee Historical Committee, which is the group that sort of led these initiatives. So the Historical Committee is a group of mostly women elders in the community that formed specifically for the purpose of collecting historical materials related to Stockbridge-Munsee history, and then using those materials to ensure that community members had ready access to their histories and their cultures, and to change the way that those histories and cultures were being taught and represented in more public spaces. So one of the co-founders of the committee, Bernice Miller, who is the woman who is the second from the left in this photo, and her husband had actually started collecting archival materials as far back as the 1930s. Arvid was the tribal chairman of the tribe for 26 years. And so as he traveled throughout the state and throughout the country on tribal business, he'd always make time to stop at different repositories and take these archival trips where he would sit in the archives and copy materials by hand. Everything from letters to treaties to land materials, and he would sit and either transcribe materials directly or take notes on them. And he would bring all of his copies and his notes back to the reservation, and then Bernice would archive them and organize them in their home to create this sort of new repository, this arsenal of knowledge that could be used by tribal members. And in particular, in this period, the tribe is, politically reorganizing. And so these documents are really essential for the tribe's new constitution and the reorganization of their government. So in 1968, a few things happened. This is about 35 years after Arvid and Bernice had started collecting. In that year, Arvid unfortunately passed away, and just a few months later, Bernice's house caught fire, and the documents that she and Arvid had collected were nearly destroyed. Neighbors actually broke a window and entered the burning house to save all of these materials that had been collected. And as a result of those two events that happened so close together, Bernice and her sister Dorothy, along with several other women in the community, really decided that it was time to formally organize and continue the work that Arvid and Bernice had set out to do, and to follow through with a goal that Arvid and Bernice had had for a long time, which was to create a true library and archive that would exist outside of the miller's home and really be open to the public and serve as a resource for the community. So the first trips in the 1960s, in actually 1968, when the historical committee was founded and when all of this started, was really about continuing that document collection mission. Because as you can imagine, a lot of the archival materials that the tribe was looking for, a lot of the information that they were looking for, is stored in repositories on the East Coast and throughout the Northeast, and scattered across the route by which the Mohicans were removed. And so this is actually what my larger research project looks at, how the historical committee assembled this new tribal archive and then used it for various public history projects, one of which are these historical trips and the many initiatives that grow out of them. So this is actually an in-progress map that I am still sort of working on to map the location of all of the different records of Mohican history that are scattered across different archives. And I want to put this in context a little bit because I don't think it's necessarily immediately obvious why collecting archival documents would be an essential part of the process of strengthening Mohican nationhood and tribal identity. So before I do that, if there's a second thing I want you to remember from this talk, it's that Native languages, identities, and cultures were never completely destroyed. Certainly, the federal government tried. They tried very hard. But in spite of the many, many targeted attempts by the US federal government to remove Native peoples from their homelands, to eliminate Native languages and cultures and histories by placing children in residential schools and actually making Native religions and cultures illegal at certain points in history, Native people, including the Mohicans, have always preserved their languages, cultures, and tribal identities. But that doesn't mean that recovery of parts of that culture and those languages hasn't been necessary, and that those things have still had to be revitalized. Removing people from land that is so directly tied to their identity, and then stealing multiple generations of their children and teaching them that their languages, cultures, histories, and religions are not only unlawful, but were really framed as evil, took a significant toll on Native cultures. And Native nations have had to do a lot of recovery work to rebuild their nations, to rebuild that sense of pride in tribal identity that these residential schools and the federal government sought to destroy, and the connection to land that's really based in the unique languages and cultures. And so in many cases, including the Mohicans, archival documents have played a very real role in those revitalization efforts. In spite of the colonial intentions of creating a lot of these documents, the anthropological materials that were produced by scholars have supported cultural revitalization in many ways. The recordings and the notes that were made by linguists and others like Thomas Jefferson, which is the image that you're seeing on the left here, have been essential sources for language revitalization. And even the observations and the notes and journals and letters that were made by early settlers and leaders like John Sargent, which is this image that you're seeing on the right, all of these materials help sort of put the pieces back together and reconstruct a national story that has been scattered and has been sought to destroy in many cases. So all of these materials have been crucial in, putting the pieces of history back together, as well as for more legal reasons, like showing that the tribe has maintained an ongoing relationship with the US federal government, which is something that's essential for federal and state recognition. And certainly we see archival documents being used in other legal matters like land battles and the repatriation of Native ancestors and material culture from different museums. So the historical committee knew all of this. They understood the power of these documents and the way that they could be harnessed for these revitalization efforts. And they, even if that's not why the materials were created in the first place, their goal was really an effort to recover the knowledge that had been lost during removal and during the boarding school eras, and to work to start to undo some of that historical and intergenerational trauma that had been passed on to future generations by using historical records and research to revitalize Stockbridge-Munsee culture and reteach tribal history in various ways. So the first trips made by the historical committee really focused on the location and the recovery of historical materials. And if we zoom in on that initial map that I showed you, you can see that the committee visited places like the Stockbridge Library in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, a couple of repositories near Boston, including the Massachusetts State Archives, and a few more repositories throughout New York, like the State Library, the Historical Society, and then places like Vassar College and Cornell. And the first couple of trips really focused on that document collection, but the trips very quickly expanded. These initial trips were maybe 8 to 10 people, but we really see by the early 1970s, the trips dramatically grow in size. And the historical committee immediately tries to involve more and more tribal members in that recovery process. So they take big groups of people to these archives and encourage them to explore the primary source materials for themselves. They use the opportunity to teach people how to use a card catalog, which we don't use anymore in archives, but at the time was, the way that you would find archival materials. They teach people how to read a finding aid, how to keep track of research notes. And then on top of that, they asked everybody on these trips to keep a journal that would be added to the tribal archive back on the reservation, which I think is actually one of the most significant parts of this record gathering mission. This really shows us that the historical committee members were such savvy archivists that they were certainly concerned with these older materials that they were trying to track down, but they also knew that history was happening right then and there in the moment, and that the reactions that their fellow tribal members were having to returning to their homelands and moving through this space were valuable knowledge that ought to be preserved. And they were right. It was really this excellent awareness of the connections between past and present that have left us with such a rich archive for these trips. You're going to hear me today read several excerpts from those reflections that tribal members have made on these trips. And it's really because of the foresight of the committee that we have those stories preserved. And they're really rich in that they show us what identity formation and nation building practices look like in the moment, and how these trips were a key part of facilitating those processes. Now, in addition to involving more people in the research process, the second thing that happens in the early 1970s is that these trips really become what we would now probably think about as heritage tourism. They become very large, highly scheduled bus trips that take tribal members to various locations throughout the Northeast, and that are significant to various locations throughout the Northeast that are significant to Stockbridge-Munsee Mohican history. And then in each of these places, they're teaching tribal history from a Mohican perspective. So we see right away that the research that was completed on these early trips is sort of immediately put to use by determining what the locations are that they want to visit on the trips, learning more about important sites in Mohican history, and then physically bringing tribal members back to those important places in Mohican ancestral homelands, and teaching tribal history to facilitate these renewed connections to these places. And so they're teaching Stockbridge-Munsee history really in a completely new way that creates these memorial geographies and really cultivates that shared set of experiences for tribal members, where together tribal members are learning Mohican history and developing a set of shared collective memories. And this is really important because when we think about what makes a nation, aside from the control over a certain set of territory, nationhood is really defined by a shared sense of identity and belonging, and really that feeling of knowing that you are part of a national story, and a shared understanding of culture. All of these things play a major role in really rebuilding a sense of Indigenous nationhood that settler colonialism sought to destroy. So in that sense, the trips become Indigenous nation building projects. And importantly, the process of creating these memorial geographies and how that relates to a sense of self is very similar to how Algonquin people in the Northeast have always understood the connections between identity and place. This is something that scholar Lisa Brooks has argued, that Algonquin people in the Northeast have always understood Native space as a network of villages, and that Algonquin identity has always been grounded of a sense of where you exist within that network of relations. So returning to this landscape and moving through this sort of web of connected places is really a way of retapping into that network of belonging, and reorienting Mohicans within this larger space. And that resulting sense of shared belonging and Mohican identity is very clear in how tribal members talk about the sense or the feeling that they have when they return to these places. Places like Shodak Island, which is shown in this image here, and that historical committee identified as the location of the last Mohican council fire. So I just want to read a couple examples to illustrate this. When I spoke with historical committee member Leah Miller about this in 2016, she said, "The first thing about it is it's a spiritual thing. When you go out there to the homeland, you can feel your ancestors. And everyone who goes there says that." Whoops, sorry, going too fast. Similarly, in my interview with historical committee member Joanne Schendler in 2017, she emphasized, when you walk the places that your ancestors were, it's just a deep feeling of knowing that your family was there. Looking at the ground they walked on the Hudson River, knowing that they were in canoes, they fished, they lived along the shores, they're buried there. That is just an amazing, amazing feeling, this very deep feeling of pride. And then finally, in her written reflection on the trip, Armina Chicks wrote that each day brought a feeling of awe and wonder, almost a sacred feeling. There was a special feeling hard to describe, as though someone from long ago was sharing a feeling of togetherness, as though someone from long ago was sharing a feeling of happiness, as though they were waiting for us. I have never experienced such a feeling of well-being. So in addition to cultivating this shared sense of belonging by just physically bringing tribal members back to these places, the trips were also a time for tribal members to actually carve out some space and claim some space for themselves within these places. So it's especially common, for instance, on the trips for tribal members to leave tobacco to honor sacred spaces, and to take and leave things like rock and soil to mark a connection between their ancestral homelands and their homes in Wisconsin. Again, which is this way of reinscribing value for themselves in landscapes and reaffirming these places as Mohican space. So just to give one example of this, the practice of laying stones is particularly well documented, both on the trips and as a historic Algonquin practice long before removal. So on contemporary trips, returning Mohicans have continued to rebuild this stone offering, which is at the base of Monument Mountain, which is the image you're seeing here, mostly by bringing rocks from Wisconsin to add to the pile, but also by adding local rocks that they find in the area. And the existence of a pile like this is well documented in historical sources from the 18th and 19th centuries and noted as being as big as 6 to 8 feet in diameter. We know it was destroyed at some point in history, but the Mohicans, more importantly, have rebuilt this pile over the last 50 or so years. And as one tribal member wrote, to us, now it means that we've returned to the land of our ancestors. So building on the creation of these memorial geographies by physically bringing tribal members back to different places and inviting them to make these spaces their own, historical committee members and now staff within the Department of Cultural Affairs, who are seen in this photo from 2019, have also used the trip to teach tribal history in a way that facilitates shared group experiences and that shared sense of belonging within a national history. And this practice in particular takes direct aim at the US federal government's attempts to erase and to downplay the importance of Native history through boarding schools in the way that the history continues to be marginalized in dominant narratives of US history. So combating that trend really requires an intentional recentering of Mohican history and really teaching that first. So historical committee members have used places like Peoples and Shodak Islands to teach about ancestral Mohican villages, and places like Stockbridge to share stories of community and kinship, but also certainly of colonization. And again, this impact is obvious in the reflections that tribal members make about this aspect of the trips. So for instance, Donnell Gardner wrote in his reflection that although I was going to be a junior in college, I have not absorbed so much history and information about my people before in my life. And that education we see in these reflections is really directly connected to a sense of pride and identity. So for instance, Arlie and Jim Davids wrote that they, quote, felt humble, felt proud, and felt sad at each of these places. It's a feeling that's hard to describe, to stand upon the spot that your ancestors lived and died. You feel that you finally found yourself as far as where you're from, if that makes any sense to you. We have the feeling of being Indian in more than name alone, and proud of it. Now, up to this point, the way I have described these trips largely echoes the larger genre of heritage tourism, which is something that, many of you are probably familiar with. And indeed, in this moment in particular, heritage tourism was incredibly popular, especially among white Americans who were the descendants of European immigrants. So during this period, we see a rise in travel to Europe. We see a rise in the interest of genealogy, and the creation of tours and products to encourage this type of tourism is also really booming. So, for example, in 1963, John F. Kennedy famously travels to Ireland to visit places that his family is from, and travel companies create various products and slogans to encourage the search for one's roots. In the case of Pan Am, it was "all of us came from someplace else." And ironically, especially for white Americans, this search is really sparked by the civil rights movement and these very powerful demonstrations of non-white identity that make white Americans also want to uncover more exciting and non-American roots. And we see that as well through Alex Haley's rather famous book, Roots, which is this story of a search for heritage of an African-American family that inspired many people of all races to search for their own heritage and learn more about their ancestors. And if anybody's interested in learning more about this phenomenon, there's a really wonderful book on this topic called Roots 2 by Matthew Fry Jacobson that kind of puts this into context. But this type of heritage tourism that we see among white Americans in particular, and then the historical trips that we see coordinated by Mohican Historical Committee members are very different for a number of reasons, even if they're happening in the same moment, and perhaps both playing off this increased interest in genealogy and heritage-based travel. And for the most part, though this is certainly not the case, the story of white European immigration is framed very positively by descendants of these immigrants. Ellis Island is positioned as this space of excitement and new beginnings. And even if European immigrants left their homes because of hardship, the vast majority of them, chose to leave to come to America. And even if there initially was pressure to assimilate, pride in those European heritages were very much accepted and supported by this moment in time. So the story of American Indian peoples reconnecting with their ancestral homelands is quite different from that narrative. Native nations were forced to leave their ancestral homelands, often through direct violence, and that left many of their ancestors dead. The US government actively aimed to eliminate Native cultures and languages by removing Native children from their homes and their families and placing them in residential boarding schools. And when these trips started, the American Indian Religious Freedom Act was still 10 years away from becoming law. So we had not reached the point yet where these languages and cultures were widely accepted by any means. So the conditions under which this cultural revitalization and recovery of history and identity is happening for the Mohicans is very different than that of white Americans in this same era who were traveling to their homelands in places like Ireland and Germany and Italy. And that certainly isn't to downplay the exciting experience of reconnecting with one's homelands and ancestors, regardless of racial identity. It's an exciting process for whoever you are. Rather, I make this comparison just to make the point that these experiences differ in really important ways, and that difference helps us understand why we get statements from Mohican tribal members like the last one that I read from Arlie and Jim Davids, who said that they felt humble, proud, and sad all at the same time. And so, as this quote suggests, the returns were not always entirely happy experiences, and I imagine they still aren't. returning to a land that your ancestors were forcibly removed from, and then retracing the route by which they were forced to leave can awaken or trigger the epigenetic trauma that's carried in genes. And this is something that we've learned a lot more about in the last, decade or so. Epigeneticists have actually studied that trauma, especially that when it's experienced at a young age, actually changes the genes in our body and impacts how we respond to stress, and that those genetic changes can be seen in how our DNA through several generations impacts how people respond to stress. So Stockbridge-Munsee people today still certainly feel the impact of their ancestors who were removed, and the multiple generations of children who were placed in Indian boarding schools. And so indeed, many tribal members wrote about this simultaneous happiness and sadness upon returning to and traveling through this network of places, and learning how their ancestors thrive, but then, certainly were forced to leave their homes. And so I just want to highlight, one of many recorded experiences that kind of portray this, and illustrates these complicated emotions quite well. And this account is from a trip in 1989. So on that trip, tribal members started their time in Stockbridge at the Norman Rockwell Museum before continuing on to the Mission House, which were both locations that they had visited before on other trips. And on this particular trip, tribal members viewed what is the final, although unfinished version of this Rockwell painting that many of you have probably seen, that depicts John Sargent meeting with Mohican leader Chief Conkapat. And then we see Sargent's wife, Abigail, sort of looking on, looking very displeased from the background. And upon viewing the painting, tribal members were certainly reminded that their ancestors were not necessarily welcome in the Sargent home, or at least not by Abigail, which of course is today preserved as the Mission House. So they went sort of straight from seeing this painting in the Rockwell Museum directly to the Mission House, which is the place portrayed in the painting. And upon getting to the Mission House, they're doing the house tour, and the tour guide is once again explaining that there is an Indian part of the house and that their ancestors could go no further than the room that they were standing in. And so there's this sort of horrible feeling of standing in a space that your ancestors were not welcome in and were not really allowed to go any further then. And in addition to that, for those of you who are familiar with the museum, you may also know that in 1989, the tribe was in the midst of a battle with museum management to repatriate a 2-volume Bible set and a 4-piece pewter communion set. Those items have since been returned to the tribe, but in 1989, they were still on display in the Mission House. And so Ruth Godinez, who was the historical committee secretary at the time, recorded this encounter in this moment. And she wrote that upon entering the Mission House that day, quote, was very hard. The first thing we saw as we entered were the Bibles. We weren't allowed to take flash pictures, but I wanted to record the faces of the Stockbridgers as they looked at their Bibles, wanting to come home. The tour is always interesting, and I had Norman Rockwell's painting in my mind as we went through the Indian part of the house. So we see in this account the very real sort of sadness that comes from seeing items on display that were stolen from the community and in moving through a space where one's ancestors weren't historically allowed. But what's really important about this is that when you look at all of the other journals and all of the other accounts from this trip, most, I would say, tribal members on this trip cite the Bibles as being the highlight of the whole trip. So we have this very complicated story of this, kind of sad moment, but also that people highlight as the peak of their trip. They were so excited to see the Bibles. So what I want to emphasize about moments like these is that tribal members are experiencing simultaneous happiness and sadness. And it's really in those moments that healing and resolve and action really happen. So, reliving trauma is certainly not an intended goal of the trips, but healing certainly is. And, the same people who study intergenerational trauma have demonstrated that understanding and confronting past traumas is really the first step for healing. So in many ways, these shared experiences of traveling through and learning in these colonized spaces actually seek to help Stockbridge-Munsee community members further understand and address the trauma of removal and colonization that their ancestors faced, while also in turn learning how they stayed together as a community and survived, and in really focusing on healing as a community by reclaiming and reinscribing spaces as valuable throughout their ancestral homelands. And in doing so, they're cultivating that shared sense of Mohican identity, that shared sense of pride, and really, again, rebuilding Mohican nationhood. Historical Committee co-founder Dorothy Davids really put this well, I thought, in one of her journals on the trips. She said, I remember that each time we crossed the Mahicannituck, we view the water in the hills with sad longing, as though forgotten memories became restless and urged us to remember. So by returning, historical committee members have urged their fellow Mohicans to remember, to heal, and to act. And that action is really where I want to turn in the final part of this presentation. Unsurprisingly, this urge to remember did not end with any of the trips that I focused on here in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. Bus tours continued throughout the late 20th century and the early 2000s, and groups of Mohicans still returned to the Northeast on almost a yearly basis, if not even more frequently. However, in many ways, the heritage tours have grown into more of just an ongoing presence in Stockbridge-Munsee homelands. The trips enabled tribal members to recover historical materials and to reteach tribal history, but it also allowed them to make connections with town residents, museums, and other tribal nations that have led to lasting collaborative partnerships and ongoing interventions in terms of the way that Stockbridge-Munsee history is represented in the Northeast. So in the late 20th century, this started with efforts to protect sacred sites like burial grounds and historic places. So for example, in the 90s, the tribe successfully fought development plans to build a Walmart on a site that had known burials. And the trips were used to send delegations of Mohicans to do research on that site and to talk with local officials. NAGPRA, which is the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, was also passed during the same period, which meant that museums were starting to return Stockbridge-Munsee ancestors that were held in their collections, and any development projects that inadvertently unearthed Native ancestors or sacred items also had to be returned to tribes. So as a result of this, the tribe started participating in several reburial ceremonies within their homelands, like the one that you see on the right here, where Leah Miller is speaking. They also supervised archaeological digs that had a high chance of unearthing cultural materials, like the photo that you see on the left, which is a site in New York State. And today they have a formalized presence in the Northeast through their Satellite Historic Preservation Office at Williams College, which Bonnie Hartley probably talked about in the last presentation in this series. More recent efforts have also included a walking trail through Stockbridge that some of you are probably familiar with. Consulting on signage in the region, like this new trail sign in Mahicannituck Preserve, to ensure that ongoing tribal connections to the region are recognized and that Mohican history is accurately portrayed, and initiating archaeological research projects to learn about tribal history, like the current project that's shown at the top left here, which is working to uncover the home site of 18th century leader John Conkapot. The tribe also regularly consults on development projects to ensure that their ancestors and historical items are treated with respect, and continue to locate archival materials that carry on that recovery process that Arvid and Bernice started in the 1930s. And I'll just say quickly, if you're interested in learning more about projects like these and following the development of these projects, I would highly recommend following the Arvid E. Miller Library Museum on Facebook. They post quite frequently about their work in Mohican homelands, and it's a great way to keep up with what's going on. So in that sense, much like the historical trips initially aimed to do, these more recent interventions continue to recover Stockbridge-Munsee Mohican history and recreate memorial geographies of Mohican history that can be used for educating Native and non-Native audiences throughout the Northeast. Non-Mohicans in the region can learn more about the native land that they're on and the ongoing connections that Stockbridge-Munsee Mohican people hold for the region. And tribal members who return to the region are more empowered than ever to learn about their histories, reorient themselves in Mohican space, and strengthen their sense of belonging within the national story of the Mohican Nation, which is a story that's now articulated not only by tribal members, but also in museum exhibits, trail markers, walking tours, and signage that's placed throughout the geography of the Northeast. And that's all I have for the formal part of the talk, but I look forward to talking to you all more in the Q&A.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Rose. That was just a fantastic talk. It was really fascinating. So if anybody has questions, type them into the chat. We have a couple in there right now, but before we start, I just wanted to ask, so how did you get started on this type of project? It's such a fascinating, it must have been such a fascinating rabbit hole to kind of go down into to learn all about this, but it's just so great to know that this work is happening. And I think a lot of people weren't realizing that it was happening. So I'm just kind of curious how you got into it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up in Wisconsin, about an hour from where the current location of the reservation is, and really wasn't super aware that the reservation was there, to be totally honest. The education in Wisconsin, like I think it probably is across most of the United States around Native histories, is pretty poor. It mostly stops at the end of the 19th century, and we don't really get a good education about the contemporary Native nations that are in the United States. So it really wasn't until I was in college that I started taking Native history courses and decided to pursue some primary source research, which led me to learning more about this oral history project that the tribe was working on at the time. I was actually really interested in the Northeast and sort of came across the Mohican name and started exploring their tribal website, realized how close in proximity I really was to this tribe that I knew very little about, but immediately realized on their tribal website that they were doing this very directive work to directly push back against the myth that's perpetuated very famously by James Fenimore Cooper, right? The last of the Mohicans. Right. So at the time they were doing an oral history project called We Are Still Here. And I was really fascinated by, these efforts to directly counter that disappearance narrative. And so I started, driving to the reservation every day over my winter and my spring breaks, and just, talking to people in the library museum, started looking at archival materials and started watching this video series. And then really realized that it was really one piece of a much larger effort to change the way that Mohican history was collected and represented. And I realized that that work really was based in the creation of this tribal archive, and that it had, many sort of iterations. And it was actually on a trip to Stockbridge that I was starting to, go through materials in the Stockbridge Library that I came across these trips. There's more records in the tribal archive, which I then looked at, but I first realized the existence of the trips when I was out in Stockbridge. So, after COVID, when you all can go into libraries again, you can look at some of these materials for yourself in the Stockbridge Library if you're interested. There's lots of really great photographs from these early trips. And so I realized that that was really a larger part of this historical recovery effort. And then, proceeded to kind of dig into these very rich materials like journals, photographs, scrapbooks of the trips from this period.
Yeah.
So,
wow. Yeah, it sounds like there's a wealth of information out there about this that was kind of hidden away for a long time.
Yeah.
So a few of the questions, I did want to answer one of them though. So somebody asked about when the Mohican History Walking Tour was launched, and I actually wanted to let Mindy know that I shared a link for it. It's in the chat. So you can go to that link and see all of the stops. It's a really great little website. So I highly recommend visiting it. So I just wanted to make sure we got that out. So Lori has a couple questions. She wanted to know first when and where you're publishing your work.
Yeah, so I am right now, my book is under contract at the University of Minnesota Press. And so it does not have a publication date yet because I'm still finishing writing it, but I hope that it'll be out in the next couple of years. I do have an article about the return of the 2-volume Bible set and the 4-piece pewter communion set, and the sort of history of those items from the Mission House Museum, that's available in the Journal of Native American and Indigenous Studies.
Oh, okay.
So that's a good place to check that out.
Yeah. Okay, great. And then Lori had a second question, Lori Weinstein. She wanted to know if you were familiar with the intertribal borderlands that were resource rich and shared with diverse Native communities. She was thinking of Great Swamp on the Connecticut-New York border and Lover's Leap in Connecticut, New Milford, Connecticut.
I'm not familiar with those. I've heard of the Great Swamp, but I'm not familiar with those spaces. No.
Yeah, no, I'm not either. So I'm actually kind of curious to go look that up and learn.
Yeah, me too.
And learn a little bit more. All right. So one other question we have here from Michael, who thought you did a great presentation. And he's asking about Skodak Island. So he used to think it was a Dutch word, but then discovered that the Abenaki word for fire is squeda or squedak. So Squedak would be the place of fire, meaning the council fire. In any case, it's probably not pronounced Shodak, but more like Skodak. Okay.
Thank you. I appreciate that. That's actually a really helpful correction. Thank you.
I know. There are quite a few words like that in the upstate New York area that have very strange pronunciations.
Yeah.
But so he was curious if you had a spelling of the Mohican name for Stockbridge.
Yes, I do. So there's a couple different spellings of this. The spelling that I use is the one that's on the Mohican tribal website. And I can type it into the chat if that's helpful. It's also on the walking tour that Heather mentioned. There's a note about Manicannituck in there. And it's really actually sort of the area that the golf course is now, that would have also been referred to as like the Great Meadow. And so, yeah, you can take a look. I think it's actually the final video in the series that talks about that space. So that's a good place for the spelling of it as well. You'll see it spelled in different ways, though. I mean, Lisa Brooks talks about Winnetocook as well, because Stockbridge is such a sort of famous example of like this experiment of colonization. And so in her book, The Common Pot, there's a slightly different spelling. So we see a couple different iterations of it, is my point.
Yeah, great. All right, so Lori clarified her question and said her question was really more about shared resource areas in Mohican lands. So she didn't know if you knew anything about that.
Do you mean in terms of like places that the tribe has put up signage and stuff like that, or are you? Tell me more.
I'm not sure. So Lori, if you're still watching, if you want to clarify a little more and ask something a little bit more specific, that'd be great. But in the meantime, Susie has a question about the presence of the tribe in Wisconsin. And she said, she too grew up very close to where the tribal lands are. My ancestors settled there at the turn of the last century. Are there records of interactions between the tribe and settlers in Wisconsin? And where could she learn more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Lots of records related to the tribe in Wisconsin. The Wisconsin Historical Society has a lot of those records. That's probably the richest place where you could look at the original documents. If you have a chance to actually go to Bowler, Wisconsin, which is the location of the Stockbridge-Munsee Reservation, the tribal archive there is actually the largest archive of Mohican materials in the world, because they have copied so many materials from other archives. So if you have the opportunity to get there, I actually recommend just starting there, because the archivists are so knowledgeable about tribal history, and they really have the largest collection, including, materials related to Wisconsin, because the Wisconsin Historical Society will give you things like the papers of John Quinney and some of the other interactions between folks in Wisconsin. But you really, the historical committee in the 1960s and 70s, you see them going to like county courthouses and really more local libraries, and really finding any sort of scrap of evidence that they can about their histories. And so you're going to get a much richer sense of those documents. Certainly the Newberry Library, where I work, I'll put in a plug for them, because we have many of the materials that are related to that period too. So that's a good place to look. And actually a lot of those materials are digitized. If you go to the Newberry's website and search in their digital collections for Stockbridge materials, you can actually view many of them online. So.
Yeah. Great. And I just shared the Mohican.com website just so that people can go there and at least get started. But someone did have a question asking if you could explain the 1936 relocation. I think they were familiar with that.
Yes, it is a very unique case, because it is a removal, but it's kind of strange. So essentially, the tribe's last removal prior to that was to a place called Red Springs, which is sort of the furthest eastern part of the reservation today. And what we see between that second to last removal in 1936 is a series of moves by the federal government to further dispossess Native people of their land. So this is a period of allotment where a lot of reservations were sort of split up into individual plots of land. And then those individual plots of land were sort of systematically then taken in various ways. A lot of people sold them because they simply needed the money. This is the time of high poverty. In other cases, we have these stories of people who were refused loans, and the only way that they could get money for a loan was by selling their land. Or there's a story actually in I'm going to keep referring to this walking tour because I just watched it again. And there's a story in there from one person whose grandmother lost their land over a grocery bill. who, you know, they went in to like pay for their groceries and didn't have the money. And so like they took her land instead. So there's all of these ways that these individual plots get dispossessed. And as we get further and further into the 20th century, there's almost no land left. And so in the 1930s, the federal government passes a law called the Indian Reorganization Act, which allows tribal governments to reorganize their governments and to write new tribal constitutions. And so the tribe was actually able to regain some of the land that was lost on the western side of the reservation. But because there was almost nothing left in Red Springs, they actually had to move in order to, you know, have some of that land. And a lot of this land they've been able to recover, and they're still working to do that. But it's a final removal of about 10 miles, and it's certainly much later than the bulk of Indian removal.
Wow. Yeah, that's over a grocery bill. I haven't watched that video yet. It's insane.
Yeah.
So Lori, who had been asking the questions about the borderlands, so she clarified and was asking about shared resources on Mohican land between different Mohican communities, and just wondered if you knew anything about that.
That's a good question. So I have, to my knowledge, there are some Mohican people that ended up in like Kansas, but I know there's been some efforts of like reunion efforts in the last, you know, maybe 40 years or so to reconnect with some of these people. I know there have also been efforts to reconnect with different Muncie people, right? There's other Muncie nations, especially in Canada. And I know that there's been a lot of language resources shared, at least between Muncie communities, because the Stockbridge-Munsee Mohican community has done language revitalization efforts for both Mohican and Muncie, but Muncie was really sort of the first language because there were more established resources, whereas Mohican really had to be, they had to really start with these like archival documents and work with linguists because there was no oral recordings of that language. So I know I've seen a lot of records from like the early 2000s of people traveling to Canada to work with other Muncie speakers and to connect with other Muncie people about that shared heritage. So I hope that answers your question, Lori. I apologize if I'm still not quite getting it.
No, that's okay. And that's great to know. And that was actually kind of a question in the back of my mind, because the Mohicans, you know, in the Muncie were, you know, spread out in so many different places. I was kind of curious if there had been a reconnection between the groups that were scattered around. Because I did notice that some people had ended up like down, like you said, down in Kansas. So and just so you know too, everybody, I shared a link to the newberry.org website, which is where Rose works, just so if people want to take a look there. I do have one more question. So someone was asking about if it's possible to visit the stone pile on Monument Mountain. That I don't know. So Catherine, if you want, I can ask a couple of people. I don't know, one of them might be on this call, but he might not want to turn his camera on and talk about it. But I can certainly ask and see if, you know, that's something that I have a feeling they don't want to publicize it because I think they probably don't want people to be taking, you know, rocks away from the pile, but I can see if it's possible. I'm certainly happy to ask Catherine on about that. So okay, so great. So Catherine says thank you. So if anybody else has any questions, you could also turn your mic on if you want, you know, to say anything, but if not, I do want to just say that this was a fascinating talk. You know, it's such a, you know, a horrible story, but at the same time, you know, knowing that they've been able to make that journey back and work to reconnect with their homelands. You know, hopefully they can keep doing that and it can become, you know, a normal thing for everybody to, you know, to reconnect that way. And, you know, so I'm glad it's getting some publicity and that, you know, you're getting the word out there about all of this. But yeah, this was a fantastic talk. I really appreciate you being here with us tonight.
Thanks so much, Heather.
Yeah. Great. I see some clapping on the video.
Yes, thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. All right, everybody. Well, thank you so much for being here tonight. And you know, email me if you have any questions, and I will follow up, Catherine, with your question about the stone pile. All right. Thanks so much, everyone. Good night.